The book's called Blue Texas, The Making of a Multiracial Democratic Coalition in the Civil Rights Era. And essentially the book draws back the curtain on the story of another Texas. It's not the Texas of big hair and cowboy conservatism that you might often associate with the state, but rather a history of, in which it's a hotbed of liberal political organizing, of civil rights activism, of trade unionism, and above all, the story I tell is how activists from different groups, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and whites, slowly came together and built an alliance, a coalition for both civil rights and labor rights and political power. There are ultimately four legs, as they call them, of this democratic coalition. The four legs are Mexican Americans, the sort of most liberal militant faction of Mexican Americans, the most liberal militant faction of African American civil rights activists, the most liberal wing of the organized labor, which becomes under the umbrella of the Texas AFL-CIO, the federation, and a group of white liberal Democrats. They become known as independent Democrats, but previously they'd been in a group called the Democrats of Texas, or DOT, which was a breakaway liberal faction within that internecine struggle for control of the party in the 1950s. People often confuse a coalition with a coalescence, or two groups that are merging together and basically lose their identity. But a coalition is the opposite. As the great civil rights activist Bernice Johnson Reagan pointed out, right, one has to have separate homes, separate houses before you can forge a coalition among different groups. And so when these groups came together, it didn't usually go well. This was not a smooth alliance. For all of the ways in which Jim Crow and Juan Crow might have certain similarities, African Americans and Mexican Americans were fundamentally distinct. They lived in separate neighborhoods, they followed different leaders, they embraced different priorities, they practiced separate religions or religious denominations, spoke separate languages. All these things separated them. So there was nothing natural about a coming together of African Americans and Mexican Americans. Instead, each group sort of learned gradually through experience that they needed each other, just as organized labor learned over time that it needed allies elsewhere. And white liberals learned over time that if they were going to keep electing their people, they were going to need to take the issues of civil rights activists more seriously. So that was the foundation. And so what would happen was they would come together for a meeting and yell at each other. Right? You don't really care about our issues. You're not sincere. Too many of our programs or our discussions are focused on, labor rights and not on these other issues. Or you're proposing a joint effort in which we would prioritize African Americans instead of Mexican Americans. And so they often failed to agree in the early years, in the 60s. And over time, the groups discover that the distinctions of class, of strategy, of tactics, of political ideology and philosophy, all of those come to matter at least as much as do ties of race or ethnicity. And so it's a very gradual process, and the book shows this process in great detail. How is it that these activists slowly learn these lessons about who's on their side and who isn't, about who they can count upon and who they can't? How do they start to hash through their various missteps? So to give you one example, I believe it was in '62, the Democratic Coalition held a meeting in Austin. They brought together all these people to try to talk about a joint campaign of some kind. But they held the meeting in a segregated hotel. So the African American attendees were forced to enter through the back in a freight elevator. By this is 1962, it's still ongoing. So naturally, that did not create a climate of trust among all the participants. And so the African American delegates had to point this out at the meeting. And Albert Pena, who was one of the chairs of this particular meeting, went out of his way to apologize for this incident. Went out of his way to talk about the issues with voter suppression that the coalition should prioritize in order to really do right by its African American members. So that was one of many examples. A few years earlier in 1958, when Henry B. Gonzalez ran for governor, a Mexican American with great following among African Americans. He had actually been involved in filibustering a whole slew of pro-segregation laws in 1957. So he had tremendous support among African Americans and Mexican Americans, but the white liberals refused to get behind his campaign, even though they didn't have a viable candidate of their own. Right? So there was ongoing conflict and tension. But the remarkable part of the story is that after each of these failures, after each of these blow-ups, each of these confrontations, they came together again. You know, the day after an election that they lost because they couldn't agree on a candidate, someone would send out a letter and say, hey, let's all get together again. And they would. They would figure out where to hold the meeting. That was a point of contention, right? Whose neighborhood, whose turf are you going to meet on? But they would eventually figure out where they're going to meet, and they would come together and they would say, all right, let's analyze where we went wrong and how we could do this better. And so over a period of years, they start to talk more openly about their differences, about their disparate needs, their separate priorities. And by 1963, they're able to launch, well, by 1963, organized labor and the white liberals, to a large extent, are forced to accept African Americans and Mexican Americans as full partners rather than junior ones, to take their issues seriously, and even to prioritize the struggles for civil rights as the top domestic issues that they were concerned with. They defined civil rights broadly. It included African American issues, freedom now, immediate integration of all facilities and jobs, but it also included Mexican American issues. It also included labor rights, the right to organize unions, the repeal of the right to work laws. They made that their priority. And so organized labor, which, as I said, was historically a white organization, had defended the segregation of jobs based on race, certainly hadn't challenged it. By 1963, the leaders of the labor movement call a press conference in which they demand that the governor of Texas call a special session of the legislature specifically to deal with civil rights issues. And they do it not out of charity or altruism or because they're bleeding heart liberals, but because they have learned that that issue is their own issue, that it's in their own self-interest to advocate for civil rights. That's their own path to victory against their longtime foes at the work site and in the political arena. So in 1963, these groups come together on a new basis. They're constantly reformulating what this coalition means. And in 1963, some 300 of them gather in a ballroom in Dallas, and they kind of relaunch this coalition. And by that point, they've settled upon a rigidly and deliberately democratic internal structure. The coalition has these 4 identified legs: Mexican Americans, African Americans, independent white liberals, and labor. Each of those 4 legs gets to send an equal number of delegates to this meeting. The meeting is chaired, and the coalition is chaired by 4 co-chairmen, each one from each leg. Each of the committees have equal representation among the groups. And when conflict arises, as it always does, instead of it tearing them apart or blunting effective coordinated action, they actually caucus in separate corners of the room and hash out the issues and talk openly about their differences and eventually agree on compromises and ways to move forward together. In the end, they do come together, and they are able to raise money from their own coffers and from outside sources to build a political ground game, a grassroots campaign field operation, unlike anything seen before or since. And it's a political campaign, but it's rooted in the civil rights movement. So they build this field operation and they graft it on top of these local struggles. They hire dozens of campaign staff, and they focus their efforts for the first time ever in Texas history on African Americans, in the inner cities, Mexican Americans in the barrios, both groups also in the rural hinterlands of East Texas and South Texas. They pair that with a program among trade unionists that's coordinated out of the organized labor, as well as women attached to organized labor. But this field campaign that the Democratic Coalition launches, they call it Project Vote, V-O-T-E, Voters of Texas Enlist. And they go around spreading this message of the struggle for freedom through building political power. Their leaflets talk about, fight segregation, register to vote today. And they manage to first register huge numbers of people and then turn them out. They do so through an army, what they call an army of block workers. block walkers, people who are local precinct captains in each neighborhood. They have as many as 10,000 block workers, volunteer block workers across the state participating, along with their dozens of paid staff. And what that means is that they train a generation of political activists. One of their campaign staffers in Houston was a woman named Barbara Jordan, right, who goes on to become first a state senator and then a United States congresswoman, right, of great repute. But this is part of her origin story. And so this coalition succeeds in 1964 in re-electing Ralph Yarborough to the Senate, in re-electing Lyndon Johnson to the presidency, right, and getting support in Texas for him. And ultimately, they transform local politics. They redraw the map of Texas elections so that now today you have these blue inner cities, central cities, surrounded by these red suburbs, right? But they succeeded in their decades-long goal of breaking down the doors of the Democratic Party and then taking it over and transforming it and using it as a vehicle to fight for things like equal employment opportunity. They helped to win the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts and then to implement those on the ground. After the law is passed, there's still segregation, and so they have to go in and keep demonstrating at lunch counters, filing cases through the courts. They have to do the same thing to open up the workplace. Mr. Moses Leroy, right, who'd been fighting for equal opportunities at work since the 1930s at least. In 1965, he finally has the tool of the EEOC, and he's able to use that to break open employment at the Southern Pacific. A few years later, he becomes the named plaintiff on a case that creates single-member voting districts in the city of Houston. So they achieve this, again, decades-long goal of winning independent political power. And it's the same people, right, over several decades doing this work. And as it turns out, what they learned was that coalition building was their secret weapon. It was the secret weapon of the civil rights activists, black, brown, and of white labor activists. That's the way they were able to extend their power into new arenas and to accomplish as much as they did. By the mid-1970s, the Democratic coalition as such comes apart in 65 and 66 for a wide variety of reasons. One of them being their own success. They had succeeded in changing the political dynamic sufficiently that new opportunities were opening up, new politicians, new configurations, new people on the scene. And ultimately, this liberal coalition is challenged on the left by a somewhat more radical coalition of Chicano power and black power activists even. The right reformulates, right? The power shifts through the suburbs, there's new districts, a lot of pieces there. Over time, the establishment Democrats move into the Republican Party and govern from that side. There's a blip in the 90s with the election of Ann Richards as a liberal Democrat, but since then, Texas has been solidly Republican. Every statewide office since '96, right, has been won by a Republican candidate, and yet the cities are these blue spots on the map, right? So that's kind of the state of where we are now. Right now there's a Senate election happening in Texas. A couple years ago, we had a rather well-publicized gubernatorial race. And people all over America are asking, is Texas going to turn blue? When will it turn blue? What are the factors that are going to be part of that? Well, I'd say there's a number of lessons from this history that give us some insight, right? So the first is that what made the Democratic coalition successful in the 1960s was that it succeeded, was that it connected high politics and the electoral arena to grassroots social movements, and particularly to morally driven insurgencies about fundamental human rights. When the coalition tried to do just politics, it didn't win. Right? When it tried to overlook some of those deeper issues and couldn't talk openly about race, it didn't win. But the more liberal it became, the more explicitly integrationist, the more committed it became to embracing unruly tactics, the more effective it became. So I think the Democratic Party in Texas and nationwide today would do well to learn from that history alone, right? That rather than focusing on organizing, turning out a sort of moderate center, it needs to think about building its many bases and combining them in a coalition. Not just one base, but many bases, right? The Democratic Party is a big tent. People come to it from all different directions. But what African Americans still want to see in the Democratic Party is one that's committed to that morally driven insurgency on behalf of human rights. They want Democrats talking about Black Lives Matter instead of downplaying it or minimizing it as mere criminal justice reform. Mexican Americans, Latinos today want a Democratic Party that is willing to embrace the immigrant rights movement, the dreamers, the people on the ground, and not be wishy-washy on those issues. And so I think that's one clear lesson for Texas, and I think nationally, that the party's path forward is by not doing politics as usual, but by truly committing itself to connecting with these grassroots social movements and to these moral causes. It remains to be seen the extent to which the Democratic Party will benefit, because it remains largely detached from a lot of these grassroots social movements. And those movements remain skeptical of the sincerity of particularly white liberal Democrats. So we're back in the 1950s in lots of ways. And in Texas in particular, I read memos from the 1950s that read almost verbatim about the ones you see circulating today, right? And they talk about the changing demographics in the state, and they make the case that the state will sort of inevitably and inexorably become a liberal democratic place, or in today's words, it'll turn blue. It didn't happen then, right? And there's nothing inevitable about it now either. Yes, the demographics, there are signs that there are some changes that would favor Democrats. There are also signs that there aren't. There's white in-migration of conservative Anglos. There's falling birth rates among Latinos. There's different trends. But what the history shows is that those numbers are less important than the ground game, than the actual organizing that takes place, than getting these various activists together in a room to hash out what their differences are, to find ways to work together despite those differences, to put them on the table and to work through them, and to build a coordinated ground game that can mobilize an army of ordinary people to volunteer as block workers, right? They were able to do that in 63, 64, into 65. We have not seen a ground game on that scale since. So I would say if the Democrats want to turn Texas blue, they're going to need to invest a lot more resources, and they're going to need to do what the Democratic Coalition did, right? Hire African Americans and Mexican Americans who are deeply embedded in those communities, who are attached to those social movements, to forge those connections and to make the party then relevant to people's daily lives and their more immediate struggles, right, of survival, of worries about police brutality and deportation and LGBT rights. And I think then and only then will we turn Texas blue.